All right, so I'm going to begin. I just want to welcome everybody to our second meeting under a new name, which is changed from ORCA to ORTC. Forgive my voice, I seem to be coming down with a cold or something. So you can go to the next slide, Eric. Just sorry, it just flickered from you to someone else. I need to see yours. Okay, so just want to remind everybody of the community group IPR policy. We've already covered this last time, so I really don't want to go over it again, but just as a general summarization that it's really important that you join the community group so that any contributions that you make can be adopted by us without having to chase people down and asking for special permissions for royalty-free API. So again, please join the community group and publish ideas to the contribute list whenever possible, whenever you're proposing something new. Okay, and go to the next slide. You skipped a slide, but that's okay. Yep. The only thing that I really want to mention here is again that we changed our name from ORCA to ORTC. That was decided upon the last meeting, and we're going to bring you up to date on what we've done with the ORTC specification to date. We're going to go over our priorities to what we think should be done for the ORTC specifications and how we're going to decide what goes in and what doesn't go in, and hopefully make some progress on some of the outstanding issues and come to some decisions here. Next slide. Okay, the dial information for people who need to get in. I presume you will have that. And has the links been published to the ORTC org website now for the slides? Okay, I did put the link into the group chat for this Hangout meeting if anybody wants to follow the slides themselves privately. Yes, good point. Is someone willing to go into the IRC room, and what is the link to the IRC? Do we have a volunteer who will be willing to write down while I talk and Eric does the slides? Or they're saying so and they're muted.
I'll do it.
Who's that?
Justin. Justin said he would do it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Justin.
What's the IRC room? Yeah.
IRC.w3.org, and then the channel is ORTC, #ORTC. Okay, so we can, and for those who don't know who I am, it's Robin Raymond. I work for Hookflash, but here I'm representing the chair for the ORTC community group. So we can move to the next slide. Again, just some reminders, some important links. The ORTC community group has changed the location, so if you haven't signed up from ORCA to ORTC, and there's a few stragglers, please go ahead and do so. And the public mailing list is also changed, so you might need to resubscribe as appropriate to that new list, so you follow what's going on. There's been a remarkable increase of activity there, so please do pay attention to that because we'll be putting a lot of issues to the list. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And of course, there's the standard ORTC.org website, and we do have the repo that goes along with it, which you can see all the outstanding issues. So every time there's a new proposal or something that goes onto the group, we put it, or an issue found with the API, we do create a mirror issue to it, but we prefer that people post the list as opposed to the issue website, and we'll track what the state is of the issue on the repo itself, as opposed to having the discussion there, at least preferably. Okay, and especially important for IPR rules. Okay, next. So today we're going to just briefly revisit the ORTC big picture. We're going to go over the ORTC value proposition, the ORTC goals, and how to assess priorities for future work. Next slide. So this is, I don't know if this has changed, Bernard, since the last time, if you've done any revisions to this.
Yeah, the RTP listener got added, and I think some of the connections to data channel to SCTP, because that got fixed as well.
Right, yeah, there was some mistakes there. So aside from some minor tweaks, it's pretty similar to what you've seen before. Again, it's a pipeline model where you wire the different objects together, and then it renders appropriately according to your wiring. You can go to the next slide, unless there's questions, but I think we can move on. Actually, the previous slide too. Well, where am I? No, that's the correct slide. Yeah, my mistake. I just got lost in my local. Okay. So the main areas for the value for ORTC 1.0 and what we see the big hitters are is that you have granular object level control over your RTC without some big tied state machine where you have to negotiate everything at once. We're not tying to a specific format in terms of that exchange as well and all the problems that go with that. And most importantly to a lot of people is layering and simulcast with per layer control so that you can actually control what's going on with the and do lots of sophisticated scenarios, which are very, very difficult when you've got one state machine to work with and a really wonky format. So we can continue. Oops, just lost myself. Okay. So the goals here is that for ORTC is that we do want to be as functional as 1.0 WebRTC. We don't really want to remove the capabilities that already exist unless there really is a strong reason to remove it, or if there's really not a strong need to keep it for whatever reason. Otherwise, we want to be at parity. And also, we want to have a very simple API to start. Well, at least that's the hope. Where when we understand more of what we need, we'll add and bolt on additional components or objects or methods or enums or whatever we need to the API to support additional scenarios, but hopefully with the understanding that we know what we want before we go ahead and bolt it in there with use cases. We do want to have a clear API set of rules that go with these APIs so that when you call a method, you know what to expect and know what order things have to be called in and what will be the behavioral side effects, as well as how you achieve certain functionality if it's not particularly clear. I'm thinking more RFC-wise or something like that.
Sorry, go ahead. How do we want to refer to the first version of ORTC? You know, we've been talking about WebRTC 2.0, but we also want to have the notion that there'll be the first version of ORTC, but then we'll add more stuff later. So is ORTC 1.0 the right way to refer to the first version of ORTC, or is that confusing because we have WebRTC 1.0 and ORTC 1.0?
I think it's definitely confusing. To be honest, but either way it's going to be confusing. So if we name this ORTC 2.0, it's going to be where's 1.0 because it doesn't exist. So okay. I don't have a correct answer to that, and I'd love to hear someone who can really think through this problem and propose something that makes sense. But
yeah, I lean toward that too.
Well, we're gonna
call it ORTC Classic.
Yeah, or just
I think we got
use the date, identify the different drafts by their publication date.
Well, the thing specifically I'd like to be able to answer is, like, if we talk about stuff that's in, the first version, or stuff that's not in the first version, like, how should we refer to that? Should we say, like, this is for 1.0, or this is for, like, the next version, or V2 of WebRTC? Like, what's the right terminology? I think that's the main thing I care about more than an exact name or anything like just how, when we're talking about stuff that's going to be in or out, what name should we use for that?
Sounds to me that we should probably come up with a roadmap and then define the names to attach some kind of identifier to each roadmap location, spot, and so that we can slate things into that. Sorry, Justin?
That was Peter. That was me.
Oh, sorry, Peter. Go ahead.
I was saying, how about 1.1 and 1.2?
Whatever. I don't care as long as it's not confusing, and I don't know what would not be confusing. So I don't have a specific proposal.
1.1 and 1.2, seem to be like, nothing's perfect. Those seem to be pretty good at not saying that, I think saying 2.0 is confusing, because then people say we're at 1.0, but 1.1, then it's clearly separate from, when we say 1.0, we're talking about WebRTC 1.0, and 1.1 is kind of talking about the first version of ORTC, and then anything that's not the first version of ORTC, we can talk about that as 1.2. And like, I imagine there'll be a whole bucket of things that we definitely are interested in, but that we don't necessarily do for what we'll now be calling 1.1.
Sounds perfectly reasonable to me. Any strong objections to that? And you're muted, so you're going to have to really speak up. Yeah, for the first version. Okay. So let me go back to the slides here. And then the final point on this particular slide is that we do want to cover reasonable community group use cases. There are some use cases we are trying to extend to that don't exist or specifically for WebRTC 1.0. And I'm thinking more mobility and simulcast and layering in that regard. But anyway, let's continue. So slide 11. I don't really want to read each one of these, but this is our definition as to what we believe really must be here versus must not be here. I don't know if people understand each one of the heading concepts here, so please pipe up if you don't understand what something means. Be happy to explain. And if you feel that we aren't addressing something that's important to you, please make mention of that.
A question, by ICE pacing, do you mean like control over the pacing, or, I mean, you've got to have pacing?
Where's ICE pacing?
In TBD.
I don't know. I didn't actually put that on the list, so I'm not even sure what that means, to be honest. This is actually a subset of the ice freezing stuff.
Oh, okay.
The relationship between ice transport objects. How do we properly model those?
So is your feeling that if we address the ice freezing issue, that'll get addressed as well?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any comprehensive treatment of that will solve that.
Okay. Okay. So otherwise, I think we can continue unless anybody else wants to say anything here. And again, these slides will be up, so if you review it later and go, oh, they didn't cover what I didn't understand it, then by all means, we can post it to the list and we'll reevaluate. So this is our criteria for what we want to include in, well, what will be 1.1. If the feature capability is already in support in WebRTC 1.0, then it's a high priority for us. API usability is very important. If we don't have a usable API, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be used anyway. We do want to make sure that whatever we incorporate, we do understand the problem space and the use cases well, so that what we define makes sense. Also, if there's any concerns regarding compatibility, those need to be brought up, because there's a whole slew of RFCs and dependent RFCs and related RFCs that might have overlooked, and not intentionally so. It's easy to get lost. And the other thing is, we do want to maintain that all features we're incorporating do have clear value proposition for the web developers and web applications that are going to be developed. Okay, so it sets a bit of a bar as to what we should and should not include. Okay, next. So, question for the community group is, do you agree with the stated goals? Do you agree with the priorities outlined? And do you have any concerns about what is stated thus far in terms of how we define criteria or any other aspects?
This is Bernard. I do have a concern about the ability to handle two potential use cases, which I'll post more to the list. But one is IPv6. We implemented that, and in addition to all the stuff about ICE IP balls, we found it was necessary to have some control over what kind of candidates were gathered, because we were seeing all kinds of different IPv6 tunnels and temporary addresses and all kinds of stuff come in and out. And so we ended up needing to have some control over the gathering of those things.
Is this because of IPv6 by default taking priority over IPv4?
Well, it was because that doesn't really make sense. I mean, there were a lot of circumstances in which you couldn't necessarily. You might have some information about whether some tunnel types were even workable, like particularly in Windows, right? We have these Teredo tunnel types, potentially 6 to 4 tunnel types. A lot of different tunnel types can start showing up in the system, and so you may want to just not gather them, or if you're willing to let them be in there, you might want to have prioritize them in a specific way to make sure that they kind of only go to the end. And you don't spend a lot of time trying to succeed with connectivity checks for unroutable addresses. So that's kind of an example where it would actually turn out to be quite tricky. And another one was where you had interfaces that might be charging per byte, and they might be fast, but they might be very expensive. And so that's a case where, again, gathering and priority control might turn out to be important.
Interesting.
So those were the two trickiest use cases that we've had to deal with in ICE, and we found we needed a lot of control over them to make sure that bad things didn't happen.
So, Bernard, I mean, how much of these things are application dependent versus things that really you just need to know? All WebRTC applications would need to deal with. Specifically, it seems like the happy eyeball stuff, that logic is something that you want to sort of globally have for the WebRTC implementation in general. Is that not reasonable because it requires a lot of application-specific knowledge, or is it just a sort of thing that would be very difficult to mandate?
Well, for the happy eyeballs one, we had to do ourselves because nobody had discovered that yet. So when we implemented, we encountered that. The charging one, I think. Maybe one the app has to deal with, depending on what the OS does with respect to how it deals with connections on those interfaces. We don't have a lot of visibility in the browser today about what interfaces are coming up and down, and actually even in the ICE candidates, we really don't know what interfaces they're associated with.
So, I mean, how would this even work then if you didn't know which interfaces were pay interfaces or free interfaces?
Well, I mean, it's something we could add. I mean, the basic thing is, are you sending over some interface? Does the user that's going to result in charges. And then, do you just use anything that's put into the system, or do you attempt to exert app level control over the usage of it?
I think QoS is sort of related to that as well, in terms of over a specific interface. Similar construct, at least.
But that wouldn't affect ICE, though, would it? I think we're just talking about ICE here.
You're muted if you're trying to respond, Chris.
I'm just thinking.
Yeah, so I guess my suggestion is just that we have specific use cases that we put out there, and then rather than getting into detailed discussions about whether you need something or not, it might help to say, hey, these are the kind of things we would like to be able to do.
Okay. Well, I think when we consider these use cases, we should consider, is this something that really should be exposed to applications because each application will do something substantially differently, or is this something part of the runtime? Should this be part of the runtime because, like, if you turn on IPv6, like, we don't want to spend a ton of time checking, basically over other things that are not going to be usable IPv6 addresses. Because, like, I think anything that we do in standards, I'd say costs us like 3x as much as what we do in implementation. So if we can just pick something that works for everyone, I think we'd be happier.
Yeah. No, I mean, in general, a lot of these things are pretty tricky, so it's not like most app developers want to do them anyway. Like dealing with the IPv6 stuff actually took a lot of work to get it right. So I'm not suggesting that, app developers are desperate to do that kind of stuff. They probably prefer not to. But
although it does sound like you do need to change the default behavior, which is in technical violation of an RFC.
Yeah, although that will be fixed by the Happy Eyeball spec, but
right. Okay, so I think we should bring these particular use cases to the list and flush them out in terms of what we need and what we'd actually need to expose to an API, and whether it needs to be a default for everyone or specific knob controls for those who actually need to control it, and why. So that would be my proposal.
Will do.
Okay. Any other concerns of the goals or anything there? Okay. Please, I'd like for Bernard, because he was generous enough to donate his time to go and fix a lot of these editor drafts while I had my head down. So if you wouldn't mind, Bernard, just explaining all the changes that happened.
Okay. So one of the things we did was to integrate several proposals from Peter Thatcher, including for support of quality resolution, frame rate, and layering, and then more support for the RTP and codec parameters. So those were issues 31 and 33. At IETF 89, they made ICE TCP mandatory to implement, and so we had an initial stab at that, which is to put in support for TCP, although we're not done yet. I think Justin has posted some more stuff that needs to be done there. And there were some things that were missing, like on local candidate actually didn't have a candidate, so we added that. We added gather policy as well, so a little bit of cleanup on the ICE side. There was a proposal from Peter for the RTP listener, which could throw unhandled RTP events, so we added that, and that was also included in the big picture. We took an initial stab at the stats API, which we'll be talking more about, but it's basically more or less along the lines of WebRTC 1.0, but it's included, it extends multiple objects. We put in an additional initial stab at the contributing sources as Emil asked for, which was issue 27. Martin pointed out that there were not default values for many attributes in the dictionaries, and also that we didn't always say what happens if dictionary entries were missing. That's probably, there'll probably be significantly more work needed to be done there, but we made an initial start in issue 39, so we put in a bunch of defaults. And then there were a ton of nits, many of which relate to example code, which is invalidated every time we make a change. We don't necessarily go back and change all the examples, and various other little things that people found. So hopefully, overall, a document now has a lot more of the functionality. I wouldn't say it's feature complete, but it's getting there, and hopefully, a lot of the little things that people found that weren't quite right are now fixed.
Thanks a lot, Bernard. Okay, so at this point, I'd just like to have just open the table in terms of, is everybody okay with where we're going with the specification? And do you have any specific questions regarding the specification as it is and as it stands today? Before we go into what's coming next. I've got a question regarding contributing sources for Emil, actually. Is this something you really need? Like, what is the value prop for that one?
So the thing is that if we agree that video conferencing is a major use case for this thing, for ORTC, it's actually currently, and actually I should probably start somewhere else. First, in my last email to the list, I actually mentioned that contributing the proposal that Peter Thatcher made about how this could be represented can actually also be used for parameters for things that you learn about the SSRC, not just the contributing sources. In particular, I'm thinking about the audio level that is pre-calculated and that you get with every packet, which is currently supported in Chrome, for example. So regardless of whether when doing conferencing you're receiving one single mixed stream or many individual audio streams, I think we would agree that you might want to show speaker levels for your speakers because they have a lot of value to identify noise, to see that you're thinking, to see that they're actually talking, and that if you're not hearing them, it's probably because I don't know, your speakers are turned off, just for comfort, a bunch of other reasons. And whether you're doing one mixed audio stream or you're receiving many multiple audio streams, you still, in either case today, it's actually very difficult to get that information. So you could potentially do that with the Web Audio API, but first, that doesn't seem to be that's not available in all browsers, right? And even with WebRTC today, you can't use it with incoming audio streams. So today, it's the only way you can actually show that information to users is to have a central entity that sends it to you over a data channel, and that's pretty inefficient. But even if you actually had the possibility to analyze audio levels locally, why would you do that if that information is already in the packets, pre-calculated in the packets that you're getting? So I'm not sure if I didn't express myself necessarily in the most structured way, but what I'm trying to say is, yes, this might not look like the immediate most critical issue that we currently have, but I think that many people are going to hit that if we agree that video conferencing is going to be a major use case for the API. So yes, I think it's an important thing.
So I want to touch on a couple things there. That I agree that if you're having a mixed conference, you're getting the CSRC information, then you need a way to get that information out of the packets. But if you're not doing mixing and you have independent streams, then we have other mechanisms that I think are just much more appropriate in this case. One, of course, you mentioned web audio. The fact that web audio doesn't work on incoming streams, like by the time the specification is actually implemented and ready, like that will be long since fixed. In addition, we have the stats interface where we can sort of query the media stream track for stats and get the audio levels out there. So like if you already are decoding the packet, you already will have a notion of what the audio levels are. The idea that there would be some stuff in the header that would signify the audio levels, it seems like it's only really useful in the case where A, you're not decoding the actual packet, or B, you have a mix and you need to have basically the contributing levels, instead of the overall level for the packet.
Well, yes, obviously it's much more important for mixed streams because, as you're saying, there's no other way you can get that information there. So the relevance in non-mixed streams and how convenient it is to do it that way, I mean, get it from the package rather than do some additional thing, look for the stats or use the web audio API or whatever. That's probably a matter of subjective opinion and
well, one requires work
yeah.
and one doesn't, right? I mean, that's the difference.
Sorry?
Well, one requires work and one doesn't. So I don't really think it's a matter of subjective opinion. The question is this part of WebRTC 1.1 or not? And, if there's other mechanisms, I agree that data channel 1 is kind of, feels like a bit of a brittle mechanism. But the other things, I think, are actually robust things that one could use. So given that, I think that, if there's a bunch of work required here, we need to say, is this something we definitely need for 1.1? And really, where I'm kind of drawing the line right now is like, I'd like to see someone saying, I'm making a conference mixer that uses CSRCs, and I definitely need this. If you're not using CSRCs, then I would sort of argue that we don't need this in 1.1. Not that we don't need it ever, but we don't need it right now.
I'm making a conference mixer that sends CSRC levels, and I could use that information. I can live without it, but not for long. And I'm actually wondering, is this a lot of work? Because it doesn't require processing or anything. It's information that's already available and just has to be bubbled up. Is this really...
Okay, well, let me address that one, Emil. So I'm not going to debate the merit whether it's a worthwhile feature for this particular one or not. But the overall concept in terms of raising the bar in terms of what gets added is that every little thing that we add into the API is just making the API that much bigger and that much more to do. So we do have to be careful in overall what we add. Having said that, if things are small and really truly small and they are extremely valuable, they should be considered. But the bar should be high. It shouldn't be low, especially for a 1.1 release. I'm not, because there is going to be a 1.2, there's going to be a 1.3, or like that's the hope. So we should decide and cut the bar off very narrowly as to what we actually include in 1.1. So what I would like to suggest here is that let's bring this to the list and let's make the case for why this needs to be in 1.1, okay, as opposed to 1.2.
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to add that I'm not going to fight hard for getting that into 1.0. I don't think it's that critical. I agree it's kind of borderline. I agree I think it's useful without being critical. But if people here think it's hard to specify and hard to implement, and if everyone feels that the alternative mechanisms are good enough for 1.0, then I can live without that. I just think it's a useful thing and not just a nice to have.
I would agree with you, Emil. I think it's more than just nice to have, but the only question is 1.1 worthy or 1.2 worthy in my mind. That's my only opinion, and that I can't answer either. So I
mean, the issue is not really the plumbing in most cases. It's the actual API construction. And the feeling that API construction is actually general enough to work for, not just this use case, future use cases we have as well. I know in the issue 27, there's been discussion of this proposed API. How do we feel about that? This is the right solution. How do we feel like we agree that this is what we want, and if we're going to do it in 1.1, we just put it in the spec, or is this still a kind of thing where we're still trying to grasp what's the right API for this?
But we already have an API, right?
Yeah,
the one that Peter proposed?
Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, we do. I guess it also needs to be evaluated in terms of is it going to cover the use case, all the use cases we need as well. Anyway, I really didn't want to monopolize the table with this issue because it really wasn't
Sure.
on the table. But at the same
Well,
time,
do we need to make the decision at this specific point of time? Can't we just postpone it for later on and
there are people, for example, us, and there's others who want to go ahead and forge ahead with this API and actually implement it. So the API does need to get resolved sooner rather than later, especially for what is in 1.1. And cutting off that bar, having a nice razor, which we cut that bar with, is really important.
Okay.
So. Yeah, I don't know if enough people are familiar with what it means in the first place. That's my only concern about making a decision about what people don't know and understand, which is why I think maybe a little bit of discussion on the list might be worthwhile in terms of making a decision. From my opinion, I would say put it into 1.2 unless there's a strong demand for 1.1. And that would be my only thing. And not because I want to derail someone's feature that they think is important. I do understand the importance of what you're saying. I'm just trying to make sure that we got 1.1 done.
right. So yeah, again, that's not monopolize the whole thing, but I guess the key things I like to understand are, do we consider the API satisfactory, and then it's just a question of, do we do it in 1.1 or 1.2, or do you still need a bunch of iteration on, the API? And just looking at the latest stuff, which seems to span both the email list and the bug tracker, I don't see anything that indicates that we're, totally in agreement. That you close the issue, so maybe you've added it to the spec, and you do consider it to be finalized.
I reviewed the issue. I had some discussions regarding it, and I think that the API is appropriate for what is needed. I don't see why it would need to change. In terms of contributing sources from a single stream, and it seems completely fine to me. But again, I'm not necessarily the most proficient in terms of all of the other RFCs and suggested RFCs that are coming down the pipe. So maybe other people know about stuff that I don't. Or are you okay with the API in 1.1 that's proposed as well?
I don't think it would be critical for RTC to. I don't think it would be a very bad thing for RTC to ship without it, but I think it would be an inconvenience for many. A workable inconvenience, but an inconvenience nonetheless.
And is the API that's in the ORTC spec right now, is that sufficient to address the issue? Or have we messed it up and got it totally wrong because we don't understand it properly?
No, it's mostly sufficient. I actually made a small suggestion in my last email. It's really minor, and with that, I think I'm perfectly fine with that API.
I'm okay with that.
Pardon, Justin? I couldn't hear you.
I'm okay with that. I'd like to kind of see. I want to go back and review what actually made it into the document, but we can until 1.2 to all the details. So.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm a little sad, to be honest, because I really like it, but I like a lot of features, so I'm going to be sad about a lot of things. But that's just the nature of getting a 1.1 out. So
yeah,
anyway.
so
Sure.
Yeah, it's basically get contributing sources. So we're saying we're going to remove that.
Yes.
Okay.
For 1.1 and move it to 1.2, even though we think that with minor tweaks it's probably okay. Okay. So hopefully we can get 1.1 done quickly so that we can get on to 1.2 immediately after. All right, let's continue. Peter, would you mind taking the floor for this one?
Sure. So basically, these are some things that I had been meaning to send to the list for a long time, but didn't send it soon enough before this meeting to be part of this agenda. So it's just coming in track as Bernard called them. So the big one is that the big proposal I put that had both quality and layering, I broke those into two different things and took some feedback from the first discussion and integrated it in, especially on the quality side. So now there are two separate things that we can talk about independently. There's already been some discussion on that. The last thing on the list is that I also posted a minor data channel cleanup around using a constructor rather than a factory method. And I think that was pretty minor. The one in the middle is basically something that we haven't posted about yet, but we plan to, which is basically how do we address non-mux RTCP. So that should be another proposal soon.
Just to be clear as to what non-mux RTCP is all about, in this case, you do have two RTC ice transport objects, and you need to point your sender object as well as your receiver object to those two independent ice transports and how you relate it. So is it implicit? Is it explicit? How do you define the relationships, et cetera, et cetera? So Peter was going to come up with a proposal on how to do that. So it's as clean an API as possible, but does the job.
Yeah, so it's coming.
Yeah. Look forward to it. Okay. So the issues on the table today, and these have been retweaked in several times so far. So hopefully going to get through some non-controversial stuff at first, and then, you know, leave some of the potential rat holes for the end. So, okay, let's... Yeah, understood. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so Bernard, you put this into the current specification. Do you want to mention what you did?
Yeah, sure. Basically, we reused what's in WebRTC 1.0. The major difference is that the stats returned are within the context of each object. So we've extended for each object the interface with the stats API, and we did include the existing stats that are in the WebRTC 1.0 application. One question is, do we need additional stats? Since we have additional objects like DTLS transport, ICE transport, and SCTP transport, we probably need stats for those. And then there's a bunch of stats which aren't when discussed in the ITF as an individual submission, but have never made it to a working group. So those are out there, I guess, mostly for sender and receiver. So that's the work that still needs to be done to figure out what to do there. And am I correct to say that some of this discussion is going on in the ITF XR block working group? I'm never quite sure where all that's supposed to happen.
There's a very limited amount going on there. I don't think that the WebRTC folks and the XR block folks are talking all that much.
Right, no, that's true.
Right now, I think that the biggest things that need to happen are, A, the stats that are at that wiki link need to make it into the 1.0 spec. The last time I checked, it was like a month ago, it still hadn't been integrated. Once they're in the 1.0 spec, then we can, of course, track them, and we can figure out, well, which objects, which stats correspond to which objects. And I did a dissection at one point that sort of took everything from a pure connection and figured out what object it should hang off of. And then that covers a lot of things that would end up being on the ICE transport object, like what is the active candidate there, and that sort of stuff. So I think if we got the stuff into the 1.0 spec and then we did basically our mapping of the 1.0 stats to 2.0, we'd be 90% of the way there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's probably the immediate objective.
That sounds completely fair, and I would just ask that if people do have use cases in which they feel that the stats that are there are not enough to be able to deploy with for whatever reason, please make your case so that we know why a particular stat needs to be incorporated or not. And can you live with a 1.1 without this stat? Because again, we're trying to keep this API to a 1.1 version to a minimum set. So does anybody have any, before we move on to TCP, does anybody have any comments on the stats or regarding that? No? Okay, good. Then let's bring it to the list if you do. Okay, so I was looking at the wrong RFC for TCP when I posted the list, unfortunately, so that's been updated. And we did incorporate a TCP enum for the transport type into the candidate. And to support this particular RFC, the 6544, I hope I typed that right, I think we just need an ICE TCP type which represents active or passive for each of the candidate pairs. So when you're testing, you know the priority of which which candidate to use, basically, when you have TCP candidates. And I don't think this is controversial, but if anybody's got any issue regarding supporting this or what it involves, please speak now.
So this would be like RTC candidate member nullable parameter that would be this form ICE TCP type.
Yes.
So there would be ICE candidate.tcp type.
Right.
Yes. So that way your browser or your system can tell you what type of candidate it's trying to offer so that you can prioritize it accordingly. Or the system can prioritize it because, the user doesn't. The web app doesn't.
So did I hear this right? This is just another entry in the ICE candidate dictionary?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good.
Just one more nullable entry and has no applicability to UDP, but is necessary for TCP so that the engine can prioritize the candidate properly. That's all it's about. Okay, I don't think there's any controversy here, so I think we can move on.
I had a couple very quick comments.
Yeah.
Do we not want an SCTP type, HTTP ICE protocol type in the enum there? In the second bullet actually, the middle one.
For the candidate type?
For the yes, enum are not the TCP type, but the one before that, the RTC. The enum RTC ICE protocol.
Are there people? Why would we be running having an SCTP candidate in ICE?
Well, I don't know.
I think because we're running SCTP.
If you have native SCTP and you want to use that for some reason.
Oh, but that isn't the way the data channel stack works.
No, nothing to do with the data channel.
Oh,
if you just in the future. Anyways, just forget it. If in the future the need occurs, then we'll probably change it at that point.
Yeah, I think we can add an enum if we need to distinguish that.
Sure. The second one is more of a clarifying question. You said that the active type in RTC ICE TCP type is something that the application needs to know so that it knows what it's offering. But if this is an active candidate, does it actually need to be offered? Or isn't that something that you would simply use to connect to a passive candidate on the other end?
No, you do need to. When I originally had the wrong RFC, the previous RFC, you could get away with it because it doesn't really matter which TCP you're going to. But in fact, that's not true because you could have a relay TCP, you could have a local TCP, and each side can offer its TCP, and you need to know who's going to connect to who and which becomes the priority candidate. And the only way you can do that is if you have active and passive tied to each individual candidates with a prioritization. So that's why it's necessary. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, I think strictly speaking, you don't need to offer these candidates. Like, just like you don't even need, if the other side is publicly reachable, you don't even need to offer your own host candidates. You can just let them be discovered as pure reflexive. But this is specified in the protocol in the ICE TCP spec that if you are basically having ICE candidates that are going to be used for connecting to the other side, not for receiving incoming connections, you mark their IP address, you mark them as active, and then when the other side sees the connection come in from that IP address, it says, okay, that's the candidate from that remote peer.
Yeah, so basically mainly for completeness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not truly technically necessary, but yeah, it makes better interop compatibility. Okay. So next slide, if there's no more controversy there. Okay, so the ICE gather policy we have basically taken from WebRTC 1.0, the enum set, and this is what we're using. I had put something on the list regarding a more extended proposal, but again, I think those should be driven by use cases. Does anybody need anything more than this? And if so, why? What's the use case so that we know we have a demand for something more? And if we don't, then we should leave it alone. And this is where Bernard mentioned before that there is some issue regarding IPv6 versus IPv4, and I do think we need to have a follow-on discussion on the list regarding those particular use cases to make sure that we either decide, is this just an overall engine policy, or is this something that needs to be tweaked by the application layer?
Yeah, so there were the two cases, the hack eyeball, which I'm hoping can be done internally, and the prioritization, I'm assuming, of non-metered versus metered interfaces.
Right.
Be a specific proposal about, or just discussion of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I forgot about the metered part.
Action for stuff on the list.
Okay. So does anybody have any? Sorry, go ahead, Emil.
Yeah, one very quick comment also here. Maybe I'm thinking this could be of interest to some applications. Maybe the possibility to say no virtual interfaces on no Teredo or something like that. If you know that you're running on the internet, for example, and for some reason you don't care about those, that might be of interest.
Yeah, that was part of what I was referring to in the IPv6 ones. Was all these weird tunnel types are showing up, and some of them are likely to be unroutable, or that's one of the problems.
Well, I know that I've had discussions with various people along the way before we even had a gather policy out about being able to filter out candidates and people. I've heard some really, wonky use cases as well as potentially some valid ones. But what I really want to see from a community group perspective is please put those demands out there so that we can discuss them and we know that they exist, and that way we can define whether they go in 1.1, do they go in 1.2, why do we need them, how do we need them, and have we got this right? Because right now it's just I propose something based upon private discussions, but it's not really based upon people demanding something. It's much better to have a demand than a push.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right, and I think that we can think about what should we expect application developers to do. If we have a thing saying, hey, use no Teredo interfaces, if you're a website, how do you know when to even set this, don't support tunnels, fit? All these things, ICE gather policy things, chain to very specific use cases. For privacy protection, you might want to have relay only. Or if you don't want to omit your internal private IPs, you can use no host. But like these other things, like I think there needs to be a very clear thing of like, if I'm a web developer, when do I set this flag? And the website, do I even have the right information to determine whether or not to set that? Because if you don't, then I think the implementation just needs to take care of it.
So, does anybody have anything they want to table as part of this discussion? Because if you don't have your ideas together now, we can always put it to the list, but we do need to discuss this soon because we do want to get this API done. So I would just put that as a caveat. Okay, I think we'll move on, and I think we'll live with this API as is. Ice freezing. This is a complicated discussion, and I've got several slides regarding what is ice freezing and what are the implications and whether we can do it implicitly versus explicitly. So first, let's define what is ice freezing as a concept. The idea here is that if you have more than one port as part of an RTP session, you would want the other ports that are related to freeze their candidate checks and wait for the primary interface to complete before they test their other candidates to make sure to not have to do a whole bunch of network traffic that is unneeded, but more importantly, to speed up the process so that you don't have needless candidate checks going on all over the place, which had the allocating firewall ports and a whole bunch of other things that you don't want to do. So in order for that to work, you do need to have relationships in some way, either be magical or not, between the ports. For example, you have an audio port and you have a video port. Well, you would want your audio port checks to potentially complete before your video ports are even allowed to start. And that's true also for RTP and RTCP, where there's probably going to be more of an explicit relationship between the two, where you would want to have your RTP complete before RTCP. So can you move on to the next slide? There's several slides regarding this. So the question is, how do we know that these transports, because they're just free-floating objects, how do we dictate that they're related at all in the first place? How do you say that video 1 and video 2 are frozen upon the audio completion, or RTP versus RTCP? So please go on to the next slide. There is the possibility to make it implicit if you follow specific rules, but there is a case where this might not work, so which might make it impossible to be implicit. So let me define how implicit could work in the first place before I explain how it might not work. So when you take what's called a foundation in ICE, and you take the type, the base IP, and when it's a relay candidate, the connecting server IP, and you combine them together, you'll create a unique foundation address. And the idea is that for every host candidate or server reflexive or relay candidate, whether you're audio or video, you will have the same foundation. And so for the audio host and the video host and the audio server reflexive and the video server reflexive, they will have the same, they will compute the same foundation candidate locally. And when you combine the local with the remote together, lost the slide. Eric? Sorry. Oh, back one. Okay. So when you combine the local and the remote together, you end up with a foundation pairing, which you could use when the audio and the video share the same pairing. You know that one could be frozen upon the other implicitly by having the same ID. And you could do a rule to say what is frozen based on the other as being something as simple as which object got created first. So if the audio object got created before the video object, therefore you'd base the freezing of the video based upon the audio. And it could be really that simple. And therefore you have to define no relationships. But there is one issue with all of this, that the freezing is only within an RTP session. If you have a different RTP session, the freezing doesn't apply. So your foundation, therefore, should be different. The problem is we don't have any concept in ORTC to say which ice transports are part of session A and which ice transports are a part of session B to know whether they should freeze together or not. And that is a fundamental problem with the implicity of the whole, making everything implicit in terms of freezing. And implicit would be really nice because then you don't have to think about how your objects relate. You just define them and you're done, right? You just work with them. But I don't know if it's possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough, but I'm not even done explaining this last part of this whole thing. So, okay. So there's that issue. So the question is, do we define, for example, a session object where we relate all the objects to, or do we just say, go to the next slide, please? Or we just say, you know what, you have no choice. You're going to have to just express your relationships between the ice transports in code, where you literally pass in one ice transport into the other, or define some kind of connector relationship between the two to say that these guys are related, so therefore they will be frozen together. So I don't have any other comment except to say that the implicit doesn't work when you're talking about multiple RTP sessions within the same sandbox of a web page.
This is really for this API. You know, since the implicit stuff doesn't work for even just a basic case where you have 2 sessions in a single web page, you can't make a conforming implementation you know, with the implicit model. The larger question is, do we need some sort of concept object that is per session? And we sort of trying to stay away from this because this is kind of getting back toward like the peer connection dot object. But this is really, you know, a question of what things really are global to a session that need to couple the things in the same session together. And so the ice freezing do mesh around like say bandwidth estimation, where we want to have an estimation session versus perhaps another session. And you know, the thing you want to, instead of having
It's been fine for me, but I don't know about everybody else.
anybody else having that problem?
Yeah, especially Justin, your voice was broken for me as well. That's why I remove my video, make sure I have the bandwidth.
Yeah, I've been having a little bit of dropouts too.
Do you want me to repeat what you said, Justin, or do you want to try again?
I think there's a fundamental issue, and stop me if you hear the broken up voice again, so I can not have to repeat a third time. What things are global to a session? And we don't really have any object to represent this stuff in ORTC right now, but I'm feeling like we might need to add one. And if we're going to add one, we should make sure that it works for everything that's global, as opposed to doing like ad hoc solutions for ICE and for anything else like bandwidth estimation. Now, I thought about it a little bit, and right now I've only come up with those 2 examples of things that might be kind of per session. But I think we should try to come up with anything else that might also need to be per session so that we can appropriately consider how large this overall change needs to be.
Do CNAMEs qualify as such a global thing?
Can you repeat, Emil? I'm sorry I didn't catch you.
CNAMEs, would they be one such global thing that you would like to be the same for your audio and video, for example, that belong to a specific session?
CNAMEs would be typically global per session, but those are things where you can program that directly On the RTP Center, you could set the CNAME, and the application could kind of, since it has the notion of what's in the session, it could set that stuff directly. If we're going to be generating CNAMEs, then we would probably want to do something different. But I think right now in Pure Connection, we have the notion of CNAME is specific to a Pure Connection, and that prevents. I forget exactly what the thing was, but basically every Pure Connection will generate a random CNAME, and that prevents linkages, but it also makes sure that things inside the same session can be synchronized. And that gives us some flexibility. So I think that what we have is actually a model that's better because not everything necessarily in a session would necessarily want to be synchronized. So making a long story short, I don't think that CNAME by itself really would be driving this issue. But I think instead of the thing that's on the slide here about the having each sort of audio and video refer to a previous object, which I think could be troubling if you got rid of like one of the objects, then you'd have to kind of update the list and everything. It would be better to just have some context, global context object of saying, this is like my session context, and everything that shares the session context should follow the rules that are like session oriented.
You don't even need an object. Couldn't you just have a string that's like freeze group ID or something?
Sure. I mean, the exact form of this object, I think, is TBD. It's possible that you might want to, if it's a string, you can never add parameters to it, right? If it's an object and it needs to have stuff in the future, we could start building that out.
It could have events, I guess, or stacks.
I could see a concept of an RTC session. I don't know. Sorry, we're conflicting audio here.
I was curious what you're saying.
Okay, I could see an RTC session object existing, not necessarily having a specific API, but just in terms of a context of different, dissimilar things having to be grouped together. For example, in this case, and potentially making it optional. Meaning that if you don't specify one, you get the one that's part of your sandbox, and it's just presumed that you're part of the same, session space. Otherwise, you can override it with the session. That's a possibility too.
That seems very sensible.
And that way, we don't have to have, we have an implicit one versus an explicit.
I'm trying to.
I think it would be important that the simple use case where someone's coming to the API and going to use it for the first time, they don't have to think about this.
Yeah, that would satisfy that then, because it would be entirely optional to specify that as a, as a parameter.
Because really, I hope that everyone who's going to use this, but in general, people who use this API, the way I would use it is to make one ICE transport and bundle everything. But it's really the interop cases, the more, I have an existing system I need to interop with, that you're going to want to be creating lots of ICE transports. And so there, you're going to be already doing more advanced things. So hopefully you can handle the more advanced options.
And you're right, Peter, and that's a very good point, is that we should put the pain of those who have to do some crazy legacy interops on them as opposed to putting the pain on everybody for entirety. Yeah, I think that we should probably table this one to the list if there's any further discussion. I think that's just an explanation as to what the issue is about, and that might be the potential solution that we discussed. So.
Well, who can take the action for basically formulating a proposal for this on the list? I think that there's been some good discussion here. I think that it would be nice to have this sort of crystallized in a single proposal that takes into account what the context object might look like, especially if it's optional.
Sure, I don't mind taking on that effort, Justin.
Well, we could do it since we're already supposed to be working on that non-much TCP.
Yeah, go ahead, knock yourself out. Either way, I don't care, just as long as we get it done. Yep. Okay, so there was been some previous and private discussions regarding, should we use new with constructors, or should we use the object-oriented factory method pattern? And there are some pros and cons to each.
Sorry to interrupt, but is this a good point where we could do what Eric was saying earlier and make sure we get through all the slides before we run out of time, and then come back to this?
This is the last set of slides.
Last slide. Okay.
Well, last set of slides. I've got a few examples to go with it, but I mean, it's basically this is it.
Okay. We have 15 to discuss it.
Yeah. Yeah. This is why we put this at the end, because I didn't think it's important in terms of having a consistent API that we move forward to, so we can finalize it. But it's not important because this can be somewhat religious debate. So. For those who don't know what the factory method pattern is, we'll get to that in a minute. But the most important pros in my mind is meaningful method signatures, so you can define names. Like if you have an object that wants to listen, you can actually say the word listen or the word connect or whatever you want to create and instantiate your object. It also creates weak coupling as well as custom hooks, so that if you need to do some particular behavior patterns in combination with what you normally knew, you can do that. And it allows for easier creation of static methods, so that well, in the typical case, if you have the word color, like an object representing color, you would have color.red, which would have a static instantiation of a particular instance of the object. And this is what it's all about, the factory method pattern. It's well established that this is generally a good principle in OO. We don't use it currently in our API, and I'm proposing that we probably should. So if you can go to the next slide. Just to explain what it is, it works exactly like a constructor, except it's a static method which returns the object. So instead of the constructor, you would have a similar, like, you can call it a create method, which creates an instance of the object as opposed to doing it through the constructor. Therefore, you got a little bit of a more looser coupling, and again, you can do things like return a simulated object when you're trying to fake something or whatever have you. It just makes the coupling a little bit easier. Go to the next slide, please. So here's an example of where you might want to have a more meaningful signature method name. And when you new an object, like new data channel, what does it actually mean? What are you doing? If you want to make it more clear as to what you're actually doing, for example, in this case, you want to open a channel. That's what you're actually doing. So you would call the open method, which would open a channel to the remote party and return you an object, as opposed to newing the object and you're not quite sure what that means explicitly. Go to the next slide, please. You can also do things where you have where your base class interface can create derived types if you want to have things like default transports. So if you want to have a data transport, which based upon a DTLS transport, you can create a data transport which allows you to create data channels. Well, you could have a method on the data transport that creates that object, as opposed to having to new the most derived interface. If you don't really care what type it is, you just say, I want a data transport, I don't care, just give me one. Well, you can do this with this pattern, and it allows you to create default things.
So let me just touch on that one briefly. So, would you imagine there'd be a create for data transport and a create for SCP transport? So if you did care about the specifics of which one you wanted to use, you would, you could just call, if you wanted SCTP specifically, you could call SCTP transport.create.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm proposing.
Okay, so it seems to me like there are kind of two different things here. One is the question of, would we like to add factory methods? And the other question is, do we want to replace all the existing constructors with factory methods? And I think those are actually two different questions. And so I would say to the first question, do we want to add any factory methods? That, like, if we think it makes sense, sure. But on the other hand, if we want to go and replace all the existing constructors with factory methods, I'd say like it's really not worth it, especially considering that that's just not how everything else works, right? So if a web developer comes to the WebRTC or sorry, the ORTC API and it's like they say, oh, I want one of these objects. How do I get one? Oh, it's different than everything else in all the web APIs out there. It's just kind of like it's different and funky for no particular reason. So I think there are different answers for that, and I would be in favor of adding factory methods where it makes sense. But going back and changing all the stuff we already have, like I don't see a big win there.
Yes, that was on my con slide, by the way, if you wouldn't mind going back a few slides to where they first introduced this. I should have mentioned that. You're absolutely right. Consistency with other APIs, that is a factor. If every other API on the planet doesn't do this in JavaScript, it might be daring, so to speak, to introduce this concept to people who would not be familiar and trying to scratch their heads to what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and in general, in some of the recent stuff, right, we've been, like we had create data channel, and the proposal is to remove it. So,
yeah, having said that, as a general principle, and especially for extending things in the future, constructors can get pretty hairy because there's only so many ways you can rearrange the parameters ordering to have different meanings or different types. So really extensibility, which I didn't put on the pros list, is a factor as well. It can be really tough to do so.
So I think as we go along, if we end up in a case where we find that we're adding like 4 or 5 constructors to a particular object, and we can say, okay, here's a case where we can use factory methods instead. But I think the default should be to just, I mean, if we're going to have only one for an object, then just have it be a constructor. That's just like the normal way of doing things. Why make it more complicated than it needs to be? I think the default should be normal constructor, and then if we find that it's getting too complex, then we can move to adding factory methods. That's my budgeting.
Does anybody care? That's the other thing I should ask. Does anybody care?
I care that we don't spend a lot of time reworking everything, and I care that we don't make things different for no good reason, and then people down the road would be like, how do I create this method? Oh, I have to call this create method. Or how do I create this object? Oh, I have to call a create method. Why can't I just use a constructor, right? It's just being different for different sake doesn't seem valuable. So those are the 2 things I care about.
The first point I'm less concerned about because it's just a matter of going through the interfaces and it wouldn't take too long to fix them. But the second point I am more concerned about in terms of having people relearn different models. Again, this is a very well-known pattern for like C++ or Java or any of those other things, but JavaScript is a different language and everybody has their own different models. So if this is too different from what people can wrap their heads around, I would be cautious as well. Having said that, Peter, you were right that there are 2 different issues, and there really isn't a problem doing potentially both. Where if you have a particular need or you want to have explicit as to what it's about, you can. The only part is then you have the confusing point of explaining, well, what's the difference between the 2? Well, there isn't any. And why do you have to? So that becomes the other side point. But
like I was saying, if you end up in a case where you have like 5 constructors and add some factory methods instead, then if someone comes along and says, hey, why do you have these factory methods? It's like, well, it's better than having 5 constructors, and then you have a reason.
So are you in favor of deprecating the constructors in that case, if that comes down to it? If we implemented the constructors and go, oh, actually, we need 5 of them.
I think if we get to that bridge, we can figure out how to cross it.
I think we think we're heading down toward 5 constructors. We could have, take an object or something instead of 5 constructors, a dictionary. That's how we've dealt with stuff like that in the past. We have a lot of facility for making things really more parameterized without having to add more parameters in JavaScript.
That's a good point, too. Basically, factory methods seem like a big hammer or a cannon, and we're shooting a fly. And then ice water would do.
Okay. Does anybody else have an opinion or care?
And my fundamental feeling on this is that we're currently in the position of using CTORs, so we kind of need something to push us in the other direction. And right now, the only thing that I've really seen that seems like a technical win is that you could have, implicit creation or of a default like transport type. If you had a quick transport and SMTP transport, you could call the data channel to automatically, or data transport parent class to automatically create what we think is the right default. But even then, you might get different things at different points in time. It's not clear that that's actually the right thing to do. So I'm left with this being largely like a style-based consideration. And I think in a style-based consideration, we do need to kind of defer to what the existing consistency is. And I think consistency kind of points us towards this constructors.
Okay. I'm fine with that. Is everybody okay with leaving it as CTORs unless there's like 5, constructors and weird oddities that are going on with it? So basically, on a strong need basis only, adding them.
I agree with
On a
that.
particular object. Sounds like the consensus here. So I'm fine with that. Okay, that's it. We have exactly 3 minutes left before we're out of time. So I don't know whose clock is accurate, but
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is Mike Champion. What's the plan for the next, when would we publish a 1.1? Any ideas?
I think we still have a number of remaining issues, and once those are flushed, and we have our long list of stuff in terms of priorities and not priorities, I think we've gotten through a lot of the priority items, honestly. So I think we're really close.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get a sense. We're talking weeks, months.
Oh, I don't want months. I need to start working on this myself right now. So I really want to get this done. Okay. I have strong motivation myself. It's just a question of, there are issues that are still outstanding, and it's just a question of how much time it's going to take to address those. And some of the stuff we're already punting on, like in terms of we don't feel we need it, and that's why we put it on the slide is, nice to have, but we might not get to it. In which case, it's punted for 1.2 or whatever have you.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
Okay, so that issues list that you see in GitHub, some of those will not be resolved in the 1.1. They're just going to remain outstanding issues, and they'll just have to get punted to 1.2. Yeah, we're gonna. I think it would be good to start a labeling policy on these issues so that it's clear. Okay, is there anything else anybody wants to add in this meeting right now before we close up? Okay, it doesn't sound like it. But so I just want to thank everybody. There's been a lot of effort from a bunch of people on this whole thing, and Bernard for taking your time out of your work to clean up the API while I had my head down, and Peter and Justin for proposing some nice big things to the API that are quite useful and providing a lot of feedback along the way, and Emil for contributing as well, and anyway, I don't want to miss any. Michael as well, you've been a great instrument along the way, especially in helping people join the group and the IPR issues around that, so great thanks there. Aside from that, that's it for now. Unless anybody wants one final thought before we go.
Travel safely.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Bye, guys.